Okay, I think we have enough people in the room for us to kick off. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to all of you joining us today. I'm Kinshu Dang, the Network and Partnerships Manager at Climate Catalyst, where I lead our work on the India Green Steel Network. This is the final Green Steel 60 knowledge sharing session for 2025, hosted by the India Green Steel Network. And I hope everyone's had a great weekend, and thank you for taking out the time to join us. Next slide, please. Before we begin, please introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, and where you're joining us from, so we have a sense of who all are in the room today. Next slide, please. Okay, let's take a quick look at today's agenda. We will begin with a presentation from Katinka Lund Vagasthar and Roma Su from SteelWatch. They will walk us through global trends that are emerging from their newly launched Steelmaker Transformation Tracker. This will be followed by a presentation from Simon Nicholas, who's a lead analyst for the global steel sector at the Institute for Energy, Economics and Financial Analysis, IEFA. Simon will share his insights from their new report on India's growing metallurgical coal risks. After both presentations, we will open the floor for questions and we will close with a short poll. Next slide, please. To those of you who are not familiar with Green Steel 60 sessions, these are quarterly 60-minute knowledge sharing sessions where we bring together evidence, insights, and ongoing work from across the Indian and global steel ecosystem. The aim of the sessions is to build a shared understanding of what is needed to accelerate steel decarbonization in India. Next slide, please. This year, through the Green Steel 60 sessions, we've heard from Indian and global experts on a range of themes, including transition finance, lessons from companies that are already decarbonizing their steel operations, and the techno-economics shaping hydrogen-based DRI investment decisions. You can scan the QR code on the screen to read the key takeaways from these sessions and access the recordings that are available online. And before we move on, a quick shout out to the team behind Green Steel 60 who make these sessions run so seamlessly. A big thank you to Firth, who's also on the call, and Harsheen for the heavy lifting from leading the coordination to managing communications for all our GS60 sessions. And also to Sakshi, Nandan, and Abhinav, who are also on the call, for always being excellent sounding boards as we shape these conversations. Next slide, please. Okay, so we'll kick us off. To begin today's discussion, we are very pleased to have Katinka, Strategic Projects Lead, and Roma, who's a steel analyst at SteelWatch, who will walk us through their newly launched Steelmaker Transformation Tracker that compares 22 steel majors across 12 countries, including JSW and Tata Steel. They will then touch upon the key trends emerging from this data and the broader constraints facing steel decarbonization. Katinka and Roma, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kinshu, and thank you to the Climate Catalyst team for letting us present here today. I have just dropped the link to the tracker in the chat, so feel free to also jump in there yourselves while I'm talking. So kicking off, I'm just going to, can you see my slides? No.
Not yet.
Let me try again. Choose, share, there we go. I think.
Yeah, we can see your screen. Go ahead.
Great. Okay, so as Kinshu alluded to, so what is the Steelmaker Transformation Tracker? It is an interactive web tool. It covers 22 companies across 12 countries. We're covering 23 indicators and data from 2019 through 2024. So the latest available data, basically. And so what is it about? This tracker is about trying to define what matters for assessing progress on decarbonization. And we are trying to enable comparison across steelmakers in leading countries globally. So some of the biggest global producers across different geographic regions. We aim to provide reliable, interpreted, accessible, and visualized data for a wide audience. And so with this, we hope to help journalists, analysts, and campaigners to monitor progress and to hold companies accountable for a cleaner and fairer steel industry. With that, I am going to actually jump into the tracker itself. So let me just do the sharing screen again. I want to show you a little bit around the tracker and how it works. So you access the tracker through our website, through the data tab, Steelmaker Transformation Tracker. If you scroll down, you see a map. This is an interactive map where you can click on the logos. You get a bit of information about the company, and you can then click into a company page, which I'll show you in a little bit. Then we get to the what matters in the steel transition. Here we've got the indicators organized in 4 different categories. So you've got emissions, coal dependency, green steel readiness, impacts on people and society. And these figures, so you can expand them by clicking on this button. Then you can see the figure a bit bigger. Or you can do a comparison, so you can click compare, and here you can choose to look at a couple of the companies, so you could select all companies. And you can also select the year. So if you want to look at, for example, 2020, and then show results. And you see when you hover the mouse over the different data points, you also get a bit more information about that data point. There's also this info button, which gives you a bit more information about the indicator that you're looking at. Scrolling further down, we've got what we've called transition basics. So this is relating to targets, 1.5 line SBTi targets or net zero targets. And then at the bottom, you've got the click through to the detailed methodology, and you've also got a download button where you can download the raw data. So all the data we've collected sits in a raw data sheet with links to all the sources of where the information was collected. Then I'm just quickly going to show the one company page. Let's see, maybe we can look at one of the Indian ones. So we'll look at JSW. So here you come to the company page. There's a bit of information on the company. You can click through to the company's official websites. And then you've got some company statistics, highlights from 2024. And then you can go into the Company Explorer. This is slightly different from the other one in that we've got a Company Operations tab. So here you can see where the company's actual steelmaking operations are. And you can, here's a thing that doesn't supposed to work. When you click on this, you're supposed to get a little thing that says, gives you a link to the wiki page, the Global Energy Monitor wiki page. But at the moment, we have some issues that needs to be solved there. One thing I want to mention as I present this is that we are aware that the map we have for India currently has the wrong boundaries. So the India map boundaries are currently incorrect. So this is something that we are working to resolve. And here you've got the same tabs as the other one. One quick difference to say on the figures that you've got here is that you can look at timelines. So basically, here you've got JSW's timeline from 2019 to 2024. And again, you can do a comparison, but then only for 5 companies at a time. So because if you have 22 companies in the timelines, it will get too messy on the figures. Just do a quick. So there you get the timelines. Okay, so trying to go through this quickly. So for the sake of time, I'm going to then hand over to Ramad to do some of the trends. Ramad, do you want me to share slides, or do you want to
I can do it. Yeah, I think. So let me do it. Can you, so I put this in full screen mode. Can you also see my screen now?
Yes.
Yes. So again, this tracker is about companies and company level reporting. So it's not about, let's say, sector-wide numbers, nor country like disaggregation, nor site level or product level. And even for these companies, and that's a very important reservation element of caution to keep in mind when talking about the tracker, the selection of companies that are covered by the tracker is not meant to be a representative sample in a statistical sense. Meaning the 22 companies, in terms of, let's say, type of technology, geographic representation, this is not a mirror of the whole steel sector in the world. Otherwise, half of it would be about China, of course, which is not the case in our tracker. The selection was made partly based on significance, like how large steel production is for these companies. But we also wanted to ensure a certain geographic diversity so that most, let's say, big steelmaking countries in the tracker are represented, even though the proportions are not the same as, let's say, their share in global steel output. Having said that, if we try to get some, let's say, across company aggregates from these 2022 companies covered, we see that if at least if we take figures from 2019, so the earliest year covered by the tracker up to 2024, yes, coal consumption is on the rise, as well as the fleet of blast furnaces. That's one element. While on the phasing in the green, so yes, near zero emissions capable, and I insist on capable because this is now still mostly gas DRI, is on the rise, but very slowly. And it's not really replacing yet, or at least it's not making a dent in blast furnace-based ironmaking capacity. Regarding green iron, or what we define this, how we define this, so based on the Rocky Mountain Institute's definition, so green iron meaning iron with a smaller GHG footprint than 350 kilogram of CO2 per ton of iron. So there is no such consumption yet, for the simple reason that there is no such production, at least at scale, like besides the pilot hybrid in Sweden. Therefore, yes, steelmaking companies cannot yet use this green iron not being produced. On the other hand, and I will come back later to this point when I will specifically focus on the Indian headquartered steel companies, we do see improving trends regarding air pollution, I mean air quality, and occupational health and safety. So what about the two India headquartered companies that are covered in the tracker? And I also insist on headquartered because, of course, the country of headquarters does not necessarily overlap with the countries of operations. So for instance, for Tata Steel, it's quite obvious that, yes, it's an Indian headquartered company, but with operations in Thailand, in the Netherlands, in the UK. So here, when I say Indian companies, these are the Indian headquartered companies. Before I get to the indicators themselves, I would like to say two things about these two companies. So first of all, India as a country has a 2070 net zero target, but actually these two companies have relatively earlier at least net zero targets, 2050 for GSW and 2045 for Tata Steel, which is I think worth mentioning. And also, before releasing the tracker, so we have contacted all the companies covered in this tracker, like to present the idea and share them with the data we collected, because even though it's publicly available, we wanted to make sure like the data is correct. And these two companies were among, yes, I would say the most active and responsive in reviewing the data in detail and having quite extensive calls with us, like to engage and explain. So yes, it was a very constructive dialogue. Now, when we look at the indicators themselves, so maybe let's start with what is probably the most significant, let's say, climate performance indicator, meaning GHG intensity, like how much GHG per ton of crude steel production. So as we can see, this for Tata Steel and GSW, these two companies have the highest GHG intensity for their steel production. You might think, oh, it's in India, so maybe it's coal-based DRI. Actually, not that much for these two companies because I think coal DRI is mostly for smaller companies. But although I cannot provide all the factors explaining these numbers, I mean, one is quite obvious and it's also visible in the record that these two companies have a relatively lower scrap use compared with other BF-BOF steelmakers in the world, which I think largely explains why they have higher GHG intensity. On the other hand, like this degeneration is on a decreasing path, at least for GSW. For Tata Steel, it's less clear, but also the data has not always been available for the entire time series, given that the company reports, I mean, at least until recently, had different reporting for the different entities, like it was in one report, but you couldn't find aggregate identity like numbers for the whole group. Therefore, it was quite hard to say what was, let's say, the group's aggregated, like consolidated identity, let's say in 2019. So regarding iron making and how it is evolving, so as I said, let's say this coal DRI element, which is quite characteristic of India. In the case of Tata Steel and GSW, it's not particularly significant. Regarding blast furnaces, however, yes, like these two companies have either undergone like recent relinings, are building, or have recently completed new blast furnaces, are announcing more to build, which is also in line with India's overall objective of a very high growth of steelmaking capacity. However, on the, let's say, non-climate, but other environmental and social responsibility, it's worth saying that Tata Steel and GSW are among the most active companies in responsible steel. And I think it's a good rebuttal of saying that against the argument that responsible steel is only for Western, if I can say so, or northern companies. In fact, like these two companies are very active and have a large share of their production covered today by core site certifications. Certified steel certificates are still missing, but yes, that might be working in progress. Regarding air pollution, it's also worth mentioning that the intensity for the different particles that were tracked, like this also is decreasing relatively fastly. I presume it was also partly because the baseline was higher maybe than for some other companies. But let's say if we think about like impact on communities, like these improvements like are very tangible, like it's like a real gain for people who live around the steel plant. So yes, it's also a performance that is, I think, worth praising. We'll stop there because yes, I know we have like a tight time, but happy to take questions later in the session.
Great. Thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. And I'm sure there are many questions from the attendees. I would encourage you all to please post your questions in the chat and we can come back to them after Simon's presentation. One message that was clear for me, at least from the presentation, is that coal continues to be the dominant pathway for steelmaking across much of the world, as well as a challenge to deep decarbonization. And this is particularly relevant for India as well, because we're looking to double our steel capacity to around 300 million tons by 2030. And as per Ernst & Young, meeting this growing demand for steel means that India's coking coal or met coal imports will also go up from about 87 million tons now to roughly 135 million tons by 2030. Today, India, of course, relies heavily on imports for close to about 90% of its met coal needs, primarily from Australia, which brings us to an important question, which is what does the future of met coal supply actually look like for India? And our next speaker will help us answer exactly that. We're joined by Simon, who's a lead analyst for the global steel sector at Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, IEFA. His recent report, titled India's Steel Sector Confronts Growing Coal Risks, which is co-authored with Soumya Nautiyal, looks at what growing uncertainty in long-term supply of met coal from Australia could mean for India's energy security. Simon, thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thanks, Kinshu. Just checking you can hear me still.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, so for those of you who aren't familiar with IEFA, we are a global energy think tank that examines issues related to energy markets, trends, and policies. I'm based in Australia. My work focuses on steel technology change and the potential impacts of that technology change on iron ore and metallurgical coal. And Australia is by far the biggest exporter of both. So as Kinshu said, today I'm going to be talking through some of the findings of a report we released a couple of weeks ago, written by myself and by my colleague Soumya, who's based in India, which highlights the growing risks associated with India's reliance on met coal imports from Australia. As I said, Australia being by far the biggest exporter of met coal. Next slide, please. So India is of course, the world's key growth market for steel demand. And the sector is experiencing a major capacity expansion, which is dominated by blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace technology pathway, which of course requires met coal. Now, India produces relatively little met coal domestically, and what it does produce is often unsuitable quality for steelmakers. As a result, India is dependent on imports of met coal for around 90% of its needs. And if India continues to build blast furnaces to meet its growing steel demand, volumes of met coal imports will have to rise. It looks like India is on course to overtake China to become the world's largest met coal importer in the next 2 to 3 years. And the problem is there are significant and growing doubts about whether long-term seaborne met coal supply will be sufficient to meet this demand, and also concerns about the cost of that met coal in the longer term. Next slide, please. So the chart on the left there breaks down India's met coal imports. Australia, of course, is by far the largest supplier. Now, the Indian government and its steelmakers are already alive to the risk of over-reliance on Australia and have been taking effective steps to reduce reliance on Australian met coal. The problem is, because Australia is the world's largest met coal exporter by far, diversifying import sources sufficiently is rather difficult. Meanwhile, the chart on the right there highlights that Australia's met coal exports have actually been dropping for 5 or 6 years, although with some stabilization recently. That's driven partly by India diversifying its import sources away from Australia and towards alternatives like Russia, whilst China has been importing more from Mongolia. But in addition, weather impacts have also reduced Australian exports. Most of Australia's met coal production is in parts of Queensland that are susceptible to major rain events, which can cause sudden supply bottlenecks and coal price spikes. And such major rain events are, perhaps not surprisingly, forecast to intensify going forward as the climate changes. Next slide, please. Now, despite the decline in Australia's exports, the Australian government continues to forecast increased Australian met coal exports going forward. But as you can see from this chart, which collates its medium-term forecasts over the last 6 years, the Australian government has a clear history, a demonstrated history of overestimating future met coal exports, with the forecasts having to be constantly reduced down year after year. The latest Australian government medium-term forecast was from March of this year. That revised export expectations down yet again, and the forecast sees Australia's met coal exports peaking in 2027 and 2028 before falling towards the end of the decade. Now, the question is that forecast from March 2025 still too high? Because I also added an S&P global forecast from July of this year, which suggests that, at least according to S&P Global, that the latest Australian government forecast is still too high. So I would suggest that India should not be relying on the Australian government's met coal export forecasts too heavily. Next slide, please. Now, going forward from here, there are a number of growing risks which further call into question the volumes of met coal that will be exported from Australia. And one of those key risks is coal mine methane. Australia's met coal mines are often particularly methane intensive, and the methane emissions produced by Australian met coal mines are receiving growing attention over here in Australia from stakeholders, including governments and from civil society. Estimates of how much met coal mine methane adds to global steel emissions vary, but calculations show it could add something like 22% when measured using a 20-year global warming potential. And in addition, it seems highly likely that there is significant underreporting of Australian coal mine methane emissions, with a growing range of analyses bringing attention to this issue. Now, Australia signed the Global Methane Pledge in 2022, meaning that it is now committed to reducing the nation's methane emissions by at least 30% by 2030. And with the true scale of met coal mine methane emissions starting to become apparent, opening new mines may become more difficult if the Australian government is serious about that pledge. In terms of recent announcements from the Australian government to do with emissions, in September of this year, the Australian government announced its interim target to reduce the nation's emissions by between 62 to 70% below 2005 levels by 2035. And at the same time, the government also published sector plans for reaching that target. The plan for the resources sector recognises the need for improved detection and measurement of methane emissions, as well as for more methane abatement at coal mines. But ultimately, achieving sufficient reduction in methane emissions for Australia to reach its 2050 net zero emissions target will require a scaling down of coal extraction and export. And more recently, during COP30 last month, Australia was among the dozens of countries that signed the Belém Declaration, which calls for a quick and just transition away from fossil fuels. India, of course, has a 2070 net zero emissions target, but it is reliant on met coal imports from a country that has a 2050 target and will need to take emissions reduction actions sooner, and that could have a significant impact on Australia's coal supply overseas. Next slide, please. So shifting to Australian banks, it's certainly true that there are fewer global bank policies restricting met coal finance than for thermal coal, but Australia's major banks are already starting to shift away from the financing of metallurgical coal mines, raising further doubts about the future of Australian supply. So in its 2024 climate report, the National Australia Bank, one of the big four banks here in Australia, stated, quote, "The group will not provide project finance for a greenfield metallurgical coal mine." And Westpac, another one of the big four banks over here, essentially made the same statement in its own climate reporting for 2024. And I think we'll see banks shift away from met coal finance. We'll see that accelerate as it becomes clearer that carbon capture and storage cannot adequately decarbonize met coal-based steelmaking, and as alternative technologies that do not use coal become more widespread. Next slide, please. So moving on to the legal hurdles and the legal risks facing Australian met coal supply. This slide shows a few headlines from 2025 here in Australia. We've seen a significant new trend here this year. Excuse me. New coal mine capacity has started to be successfully challenged in Australian courts on emission and climate grounds, as highlighted by some of these headlines. And there's more to come, I think, because in an ongoing case, legal action is underway seeking the refusal of approvals for Whitehaven Coal's Winchester South met coal mine in Queensland, one of the largest greenfield coal mines proposed in Australia. And that case, again, is focused on the climate impacts caused by burning coal overseas. So although Australian governments, federal and state governments, are still currently approving some coal mine expansions, I think it is far from a foregone conclusion that this will continue at the same level going forward. Yeah, there are a growing number of examples now in a new trend, examples of Australian coal mines not getting planning approval or having their approval successfully challenged in court. Next slide, please. So Queensland, which is Australia's largest met coal producing state and the world's leading seaborne exporter, is seeing the cost of mining met coal rise, leading to reduced profits and even losses in some cases. So BHP, Australia's leading met coal exporter through its BHP Mitsubishi Alliance, BMA, that has suffered from increasing costs for several years now, as this chart shows. Around 40% of BMA's met coal goes to India. Now, earlier this year, the CEO of BHP, Mike Henry, said that, quote, BHP will not invest in any growth capital in Queensland, both for cost and risk, calling the state, quote, no longer investable for long-term projects. Now, BHP there is trying to pressure the Queensland government to reduce coal royalties. But the simple fact is that facing Queensland coal mining is that the cheaply available coal has all been mined out already, and operations are having to mine deeper to maintain production. That incurs higher costs from more earth needing to be moved, more fuel used, and higher equipment maintenance. And labour costs are also rising here in Australia. I don't think that's a reversible trend, given that it is likely to get harder to open up greenfield met coal mines in Australia. Comparing coal mine company costs from 2018 to 2025 shows that unit costs have risen by up to 50% across the sector. And some coal operations in Queensland have recently been forced to close completely because they're no longer profitable. So the financial case for investing in met coal mining has been reducing recently, further calling into doubt the long-term Australian met coal supply available to India. Next slide, please. Longer term, any future shortfall in Australian met coal production arising from the risks highlighted earlier in this presentation, that could lead to structurally higher prices for India if it is still reliant on blast furnace technology. Now, that may help Australian coal miners overcome their increasingly high cost base, but that would simply transfer the impact of higher costs onto Indian steelmakers. And in fact, Australian coal miners are depending on structurally higher met coal prices in the longer term, as they are making clear to their investors. And I've put some of the recent quotes from some of those coal miners in that slide. Next slide, please. So what are our recommendations to address this growing energy security problem? Well, the great majority of India's domestic met coal does not meet the quality requirements of steelmakers due to the high ash content and sulfur levels. So instead, India should accelerate the transition to alternative steelmaking technologies that don't rely on met coal at all. One clear alternative gaining traction globally is scrap steel recycling through electric arc furnaces. Scrap steel has the potential in the longer term to be a strategic resource that can help reduce India's requirement for the import of both met coal and iron ore in the longer term. Now, while larger volumes of scrap steel won't become available for some time, its benefits in terms of energy and material security are such that India should prioritize scrap collection, logistics, and processing now in order to put itself in the best possible position to gain from increasing volumes in the future. And then domestically produced green hydrogen used in steelmaking as an alternative to met coal also represents a major energy security opportunity for India, which is one of the most promising locations to produce cost-competitive green hydrogen along with China, as this chart from Bloomberg New Energy Finance shows. some Indian steelmakers that have already begun to turn towards green hydrogen at a smaller scale at the moment. But this option should become an even greater priority for India. Yeah, so India should be prioritizing domestic use of green hydrogen, prioritize that over exports in sectors such as steel. Next slide, please, which is the last one. I won't go through it in the interest of time, but that's a summary of our key findings from our report. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Simon. Thank you for that presentation. We have quite a few questions in the chat. I'll begin with the question from Deborko. Deborko, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question for Simon?
Yeah, hi, Simon. Good afternoon. Am I audible? I'm actually on the road.
Yes, you are.
I think
Go
a part of my question is already answered. I think I raised the question too early, but I'd still like to get a view from Simon. Do you want to see this as a problem sides? I mean, one way the demand is falling for the Australian exports, as well as there is a lot of internal issues I can see because of which the met coal production itself is stalling? Or is it one reason is much more prominent than the other?
I think the most likely, or the best answer to that is that a lot of those risks feed off each other, and one makes the other more of a problem. So one thing I didn't get a chance to go into too much depth on was carbon capture and storage. I mean, there is not a single commercial scale CCS project for met coal based steelmaking anywhere in the world, and it seems very unlikely that it's going to play much of a role in seriously decarbonising blast furnace based steelmaking. And I think that will probably have an impact on the financing available for metallurgical coal. So as I sort of touched on in my presentation, we're seeing financiers, some of the big banks in Australia already shifting away from met coal, but that will likely only shift faster as it gets clearer that CCS it's just not going to cut it, and it will also start to move faster as alternative technologies that don't use met coal become more visible and more available. I think the methane issue will also have an influence on banks. So I think a lot of these risks are going to feed off each other in that kind of interaction. But if I had to choose one, I would say keep an eye on the methane problem.
Okay, thanks, Simon.
Thank you. Thanks, Simon. There's another question for you, Simon, but before I go to that, I have a quick question for the SteelWatch team. I was curious to know, in your tracker, which regions or companies are showing the fastest shift away from coal-based steelmaking, and what would you say is driving this movement?
Should I continue? I don't know.
Yeah, feel free
Okay.
to go.
Yes, so maybe that will not be surprising, but so in regarding European companies, we have in the tracker ThyssenKrupp and SSAB. That's not everything that is in Europe in terms of operations, because then we would also have Arcelor and Tata Partly, etc. But at least for these two companies, yes, we can say they are leading, at least in terms of intention. They have SBTi 1.5 verified climate targets. They have the intention to close down all their blast furnaces. ThyssenKrupp is building a DRI plant that is expected to be ultimately fed with green hydrogen. And yes, I guess the reason for that is the soon to be started phase out of ETS-free allowances. So running a blast furnace will become very expensive in short term. And subsidies, of course. I mean, for SEBI, not that much, maybe, but for ThyssenKrupp, it's also like a big check from the German authorities at large.
It makes sense. Thank you. Julio also has a question for Simon, but I think he's unable to mute himself. So I'll quickly ask the question on his behalf. He's asking if is coal moving to become a stranded asset under the pressure of GHG global reductions policies, particularly with the steel economy pushing to decarbonize its value and supply chain. This is for you, Simon.
I think in terms of existing, if we take existing coal mines, met coal mines in Australia, they're probably not stranded if they are existing and already producing, because metallurgical coal use in India is not going to disappear overnight or even in the next few years. It may not be too long until we get to a point where any new greenfield met coal mines in Australia may start to have this sort of problem. But that's if they can actually get approved. And part of what I'm saying is that some of those coal mines they're just even if the demand is there in India and other places, if India does continue to build blast furnaces, normally what would happen is that the demand would lead to a increase in price such that new supply would come online to meet that, and the market would go back into balance. But because of all the pressures that are being faced increasingly by coal miners operating in Australia, that just may not happen. They may not be able to open up those mines. I think the stranded asset risk is probably more about new blast furnaces in India, and whether any new blast furnaces will be able to secure a met coal supply and at what cost. It's not just about the supply, it's the cost of supply as well. And I certainly, as I said in my presentations, the Australian met coal miners are telling their investors that they expect there to be structurally higher met coal prices in the longer term, which means that Indian steelmakers, blast furnace operators would be faced with permanently higher met coal prices. So I think the stranding issue is probably more an issue for the Indian steelmakers.
Great, thank you. Dakshish has a question as well. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, Dakshish?
Yeah, thanks, Kinshu. Thanks, everybody. This question is not just for the speakers, but the panelists in general. I think somebody's already asked this in the chat, but I was just curious to see if anybody has thoughts about the future of how soon are we going to see DRI using green hydrogen in India or even natural gas? Can we see it in the next 3 to 5 years? If not, then what's the alternative transition pathway apart from CCUS with blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace?
Well, I can start. I don't think we'll see, well, maybe I'll be surprised, but I don't think we'll see a DRI plant in India running on 100% green hydrogen in the next 3 to 5 years. But I wouldn't be that surprised if we see a DRI plant in India running on, say, 5 to 10% green hydrogen, and then gradually scaling up from there. That's what we're already starting to see in places like Oman, which is which is a country that has a steel industry based on DRI, with some fairly significant expansions in the works. And there in Oman, any new DRI plant is required to use 10 to 15% green hydrogen and then scale up from there. So we don't have to shift straight to 100% green hydrogen. There can be a mix of natural gas and green hydrogen. Of course, the problem in India is that supply of natural gas as well, which is an extra issue that India has to contend with. But I certainly would not be surprised to see some green hydrogen use in DRI in India. I mean, it's at a very small scale that's already happening.
Katinka,
Thank you.
Roman, do you want to take that question or?
Well, I'm not familiar enough with the Indian context to provide more that what Simon said, but for sure we see that India has a quite ambitious, I think, green hydrogen mission, and there has also been support granted by the authorities to at least pilot projects in steel decarbonisation, partly based on green hydrogen. So as Simon said, I also don't think there will be a fully operating 100% green hydrogen plan running, let's say, in the next 3 or 5 years. But it's not that, let's say, the development of this route is completely closed. There are already some seeds, but yes, when they will mature this. I'm not familiar enough to answer on this.
Sure. On the question of hydrogen, actually, Simon, I have a question for you. India recently revised its green hydrogen production target downwards from 5 MTPA to 3 MTPA by 2030. I'm curious to know from you how you are interpreting that, especially given that the sense is that steel might not be the early off-taker of hydrogen in India, at least, and fertilizer sector and chemicals, etc., seem to be the leading off-takers. Would be curious to know how you're interpreting that revision of target.
Well, it's probably not a surprise, given that we've basically seen that this is a global issue, not just an Indian issue. Green hydrogen development has been slowing globally, and I think that's partly, well, there's many reasons. It hasn't got as cheap as quickly as forecast a few years ago. But I still think there is the issue of too much focus on producing green hydrogen for export, either as hydrogen or as green ammonia. I still don't see exports making too much sense, and everyone, including India, needs to be absolutely prioritizing domestic use of any green hydrogen production. I would be very happy for it to be used in fertilizer and chemical industries in India, even before the steel industry, because that would just get that domestic green hydrogen industry going, and then steel can benefit from that. So even though this slowdown has been going on for 2 or 3 years globally, I still see too much emphasis on use of green hydrogen that just doesn't make any sense. And everyone, including India, needs to be targeting a smaller group of sectors: fertilizer, chemicals, steel, any sector that already uses hydrogen. And that includes, of course, DRI-based ironmaking. So those are the ones that make sense. Yeah, so I'm still positive. India still looks like one of the better places in the world to be making green hydrogen, at least in the sort of medium to long term. It looks like India can be competitive before most other countries. So I'm still hopeful.
Great. Just checking in with the attendees if there are any more questions for our speakers. Okay, I see one more. Julio, are you able to unmute yourself now, or should I ask the question on your behalf? Okay, his mic's not working. So his question is, how much EU CBAM do you think will play a role in speeding up, facilitating the process of Indian decarbonisation transition? This is an open question to anyone who might want to take it.
I think it probably will play a role. Of course, the big challenge that India faces is not producing steel for export to EU. It's producing enough steel for its fast-growing domestic demand growth. But potentially, if some Indian steelmakers are serious about developing steel plants specifically for export to places like the European Union, it could catalyze things a bit quicker. But yeah, the big challenge is meeting Indian demand, not the demand of the European Union. Yeah.
Would you like to come in, Katinka or Roma?
I mean, I would be more intrigued actually to hear what Indian colleagues think in this regard, because I think they probably have better better answers to this question than we do in terms of the Indian markets.
Anybody who would like to come in? I don't know if Vishal is still on the call. Vishal from WWF India, they lead the India Green Steel Coalition and they work directly with Indian steel industry. Vishal, would you like to come in if you're still on the call?
Yeah, hi, Kinshu.
Yeah, curious to get your thoughts on the role you think EU CBAM will play in speeding up the process of decarbonization in India, steel decarbonization.
We all know that the exposure of EU market for the steel sector is not substantive. Having said that, we still export specialized steel in the EU market. We have a huge domestic consumption. And we see that the domestic consumption in the next decade is not going to taper out or flatten out. So that gives the Indian market a cushion, a protective approach from the regulations going international regulations on the carbon-based mechanism. But yes, there would be implication on the companies who are into specialized sector, especially the alloyed steel and who are selling not the primary CR and HR coils, but the products which are being sold in the EU market. So I don't see a huge pressure is going to come, especially if you see the integrated steel plant, at least are not into domain of exporting largely in the EU. So that's something I could say. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes sense. And in fact, we're seeing some sort of like a split approach from a lot of producers as well. So JSW, for instance, is setting up a gas-based hydrogen plant, especially for export purposes, while they continue to sort of, continue to do business as usual for the other, for India-based production. Sakshi, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add that all of that makes sense, and I agree with Vishal and what you just said. Can show that there's a split production technique that ISPs are taking on. I think this is also why the carbon credit trading scheme has taken off as quickly as it has, right? In the interest of having a carbon market in India means that the government can collect the revenue it would otherwise give, or the companies would otherwise give to Europe or to European suppliers and eventually to the European government. That would be collected here rather than sending it over there. But I think it's going to take some time until that entire mechanism is set up effectively to be able to capture that revenue domestically before it's sent abroad. But again, I think it's important to reiterate that this is again a small sliver of the market we're talking about, but still important enough in terms of revenue that it's going to affect initial production. But most of it is going to still follow the blast furnace route, which is the key challenge that we're all dealing with.
Thank you. Caroline, do you want to come in? Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Caroline from SteelWatch. We can look at the numbers, the share of exports of any country to the EU, the costs, how carbon pricing will work, or we can look at the change drivers. And if we look at China, for example, well, maybe not true now, but when CBAM was first being developed, China was exporting a relatively small share to the EU. That's leaving aside what's happened in the last year. But it sparked a conversation, and I have had people involved in China tell me face to face, we scrutinized really carefully what the EU was decided, and then we decided our own one, which was announced last year and confirmed in April, and now steel is going to be part of emissions trading. Same in Turkey, same in South Korea. So we think that the emissions trading scheme and CBAM, which we see as mirrors, as climate policy, not trade policy, are sparking conversations everywhere. Maybe not everywhere, but in many important places. And that will change behavior. So not necessarily inside India, but as you say, Indian companies in other markets. It'll change behavior in other productions. So it will create a different, we hope, narrative and set of expectations of what happens in steel. Because this year's been tough in terms of expectations of decarbonisation. I wouldn't say demands have gone forward. There's been some stalling. but we think that the most important impact of CBAM in some countries isn't represented in the numbers, which might be less than 5%, but the ripples of change in decision-making circles.
Thank you. You're right. I mean, it will definitely act as a catalyst. That's for sure. Anybody else would like to come in or ask a question? Okay, I think we can wrap up. Well, thank you so much to both of our speakers, Katinka, Roma, and Simon, for taking out the time. And thank you so much to all our attendees for participating and contributing to the discussion. A short feedback poll will appear on your screen, so would request you to please let us know how useful you found the session to be. We'll also circulate the links to the tracker and IEFA's new report, along with a short summary of today's session. Thank you once again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future Green Steel 60 sessions. Have a good rest of your day, and see you all next year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.